4. Well, thank you for joining us. This is 10 out of 10, the podcast where we aspire to give you 10 takeaways in 10 short minutes. And I am Mark Schumacher, and I'm very excited today to have as our guest Cary Davis. He is President, CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities. And Cary, first of all, I'm very glad that you're joining us because there is so much that's happened relating to tariffs that ripple through the ports in our country. So thank you so much for being with us. And I'm going to start the clock literally right now for our 10 minutes, and we'll get moving here. I think the first thing that I would just really like to have you give a kind of a little bit of a sort of a scene setter here is we've heard a lot from people like Gene Soroka, Executive Director of Port of Los Angeles, about how Long Beach, LA, huge starts to the year. So my question is right now is the tariff issue now impacting the ports, or the ports seeing right now an influx of cargo as people are trying to get ahead of the tariffs?
Mark, thanks so much for having me on the
Of course.
show. And to your point of it being a heady time, the President of the United States only about 2 months, less than 2 months ago at this point, gave his address to Congress, State of the Union, basically. And I'll tell you that no one who works on maritime supply chain shipping policy in Washington, D.C. can ever remember a time when a president of the United States mentioned U.S. shipping, port infrastructure, things like that in his State of the Union. So we feel like it's a challenging time, but laden with opportunities. I think you pretty much captured the moment. We were at the tipping point, or the fork in the road, when a lot of the early successes of Q1 calendar year 25 are basically starting to fall off a cliff. Record volumes, or volumes at least on par with recent surge years in January, February, March. And right at this moment, I think volumes have kept pace with that. But as we look to future orders, those that should be setting sail from Southeast Asia right now, those are falling off a cliff. And a couple of the numbers that some of the large gateways have cited are anywhere between 10 and 40% outlook decline from recent years. So we're right at that inflection point.
A couple of things that I want to focus on real quick relating to those things. So if the cargo volumes are dropping off, I mean, what does that look like? Are these companies going to be flexing down? Are we talking about layoffs? All of those sorts of things as possibilities? And if so, will the consumer eventually be seeing cost increases based upon these impacts on the port? The ports have been an arm's length for a lot of consumers, but I'm just wondering if this is now really connecting everybody a lot closer than they have in the past.
Ports are, to the extent some of the ports are in their budgeting cycle right now, they're definitely preparing for potentially much lower volumes. As you cited, a couple port directors were in the news talking about that. We saw this week that the CEOs of the big box, including Walmart, Target, and others, were at the White House saying that inventories are still sufficient here in the US. So it'll be at least a few weeks and possibly a few months before the end consumer feels any, I don't like to use the term, but shortages or price surges. Inventories are probably strong enough to withstand the immense uncertainty over the next few weeks and months, but downstream consumers will eventually feel that. We have to talk about this, Mark, specifically in the port industry, are facing a new proposed port tax for Chinese ships. This is still in the works with the government, and in fact, the government is hearing a lot of the concerns of the industry on this and improving piecemeal the proposal, which we're marching towards some sort of final probable port tax. That, of course, will cause inflationary pressures across the supply chain. And I think finally, I mentioned how medium and long-term orders are falling off a cliff of sorts. We're seeing a lot of blank sailings. That is c- canceled routes, canceled shippings from Southeast Asia, especially, which are uncertainty, but mostly tariff driven. And we're also seeing a lot of cargo pile up on the docks at their point of origin in Southeast Asia too, because of tariff uncertainty.
I mean, it seems to me like now the ports are going to be really become the bellwether almost, if you will, for what's going to happen to the consumer going forward more than perhaps ever. So it's almost, I think, inherent in all of us in the industry to make sure that we keep tabs on what's happening at the ports as an idea about what we're going to be looking at coming forward. And really quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's been so much infrastructure upgrades in the port system and more in the works. How is this going to impact that? Are you concerned about the modernization of ports slowing down because of this lack of income, if you will, and certain things like that? When you're also talking about companies that lease port facilities doing less business, are you concerned about the health of the future of our ports based on what's happening right now?
In a vacuum, not particularly. I'm actually quite bullish, but there are two ways to look at this. One is, can the volumes, if not artificially depressed by trade suppressing policies, can those volumes justify the upgrades that have been made at ports? Because to your point, Congress in recent years, with leveraged investments from the private sector, we're we're experiencing a renaissance in port infrastructure, right?
Sure.
We're recapitalizing infrastructure that had really been last built and upgraded in the years and a couple decades post World War II, Eisenhower era, basically. So, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Congress passed under President Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of infrastructure sections, that was also passed under President Biden. We have rebuilt and recapitalized a lot of port infrastructure. If we don't artificially suppress the US's dominant position in US trade through tariff policy, the trade volumes will justify all that investment that's being made. But if we decide that we don't want to be a trading superpower anymore and we want to try to reshore or protect everything, then we might be left with some stranded assets at the ports or some unjustified investment. The other side of that coin, if you will, is will Congress continue making the investments that they've made down payments on in recent years through those big legislative vehicles by finishing the job, by getting a lot of the smaller and mid-sized ports that needed some capital upgrades done, by doing investments in a lot of the digital architecture of ports as we digitize the supply chain. So as we debate what the next infrastructure bill will look like in Congress, we'll know the answer as to whether Congress is going to sort of double down on their really good down payment for port infrastructure, or whether they're going to refocus dollars elsewhere, or just simply stop spending as much federal dollars on American infrastructure. So
A lot
those are
at
the ways that
stake.
I think about sort of whether the investments that have been made so far will match up with what the future will look like.
And I understand you're still somewhat optimistic, but very pragmatic at the same time. This is really kind of all bets are off, or potentially could be at some point. Tell us this
Look,
I'm sorry, no,
Mark,
go ahead.
Mark, if I could, I mean,
Sure.
it was a great era for rethinking the role of ports with pollution and changing the way that we do business to greener, electrified, alternative energy
Mhm.
ways of powering ports, vessels, and doing even alternative energy production at the ports, like through offshore wind projects that ports have a huge role in. But all of those projects are coming to a halt, and it's the prerogative of this president and his administration to prioritize what sort of infrastructure projects they want to do. But again, we don't want to strand these assets, and we certainly don't want to lose ground to the rest of the world that's making these types of investments at their ports.
We have about a minute and a half left. Can you talk about what some of the policy and industry priorities you have right now going forward in this current environment?
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity, Mark. This is the bread and butter of what we do on a daily basis, trying to tell members of Congress and the President of the United States those infrastructure policy and regulatory needs of the industry. So I just hit on a big one, which is the need to continue investing in port infrastructure, and you can make a green way of doing business case, you can make a supply chain resilience case, or you can make a jobs case, because 22 million American jobs are directly and indirectly supported by the commerce at ports. And it's not just cargo, it's not just household consumables. Think about cruising and tourism, which is a growing market segment for ports and shipping, especially with all the baby boomer retires. It's a great way to see the world. And one thing that President Trump would love to hear is every time a foreigner comes through a US port for vacation, that is an export. That is measured as a United States export. So
Mhm.
policymakers forget that sometimes. So investing in port infrastructure for all the policy cases that I've made, and wrapped up in a lot of this tariff policy is the availability of critical cargo handling equipment at the ports. So these are the cranes, the forklifts, the mobile harbor cranes, the on-dock rail, and the steam engines that move that rail, the switchers, all these types of equipment that go into making a port complex run. It can be hard and relatively expensive to procure this equipment, especially if the government is saying you can no longer get world-class cranes, which are made in China, which we've been sourcing from China. So we're working diligently with the United States government to see if we can reshore the manufacture of some of those advanced equipment, such as the large ship-to-shore cranes, make them here in America, or work with our allies to make them so that we can get world-class equipment at our ports to move the cargo.
Harry, that's our 10 minutes. And thank you so much. And we will certainly revisit this again. But thanks for really beginning, I think, in some cases, a lot of these conversations, not just giving us, sort of the update here, but you're really planting a lot of seeds here about things that we need to be thinking about and the ripple effects to US consumers. So once again, Cary Davis, President and CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities, we appreciate having you here on 10 out of 10. I'm Mark Schumacher, and we will see you next time.